The snow had been coming down for an hour by the time I cut the engine outside her building, and I sat there afterward longer than I should have, watching it collect on the windshield in a way that made the world outside go soft and unfamiliar. I wasn't looking at the snow. I was hearing 9 words on a loop, the way you hear a song you didn't choose to remember. She'd said them quietly, not nervously, not dramatically. The way you'd ask someone to pass a napkin. Hold my hand, and don't let go until I tell you to. My hand had been on the gear shift. Hers found it before I'd finished putting the car in park, and for 1 full second, maybe 2, I had no idea what was happening, only that something in my chest had gone very still, the way a room goes still right before a clock strikes. My name is Theo Calloway. I'm 33. I restore clocks and watches for a living, mostly antiques, mostly things other people have given up on. People bring me things that have stopped. My job is to figure out why, and then to convince the thing to start again without breaking what made it itself in the first place. Before I go any further, if you're watching this right now, tell me in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. These stories keep finding people in places I never expected, and I want to know yours. All right, back to it. She was my best friend's mother. That's not a complication. That's a wall, the kind you build into the foundation of a friendship without ever discussing it, because some rules are sturdier for never being said out loud. I had observed that wall faithfully for 15 years. That night, in the time it took her hand to find mine, I felt it come loose at exactly 1 hinge, and I had no idea yet how far that single hinge was going to swing. My shop is called Calloway & Sons, a small private joke, since there were never any sons, and no father in the business either. The sign was already hanging there when I bought the lease 8 years ago from a watchmaker who retired to Portugal and didn't feel like paying to have it repainted. I kept the name because changing it felt like erasing somebody. People think clock repair is delicate work, and it is. But what they miss is that it's also detective work. Something stopped. Something always has a reason. You don't fix it by forcing the hands forward. You take the whole thing apart, gently, in order, until you find the one part that's actually wrong, and you leave everything else exactly as it was. My ex-wife, Sasha, used to say I explained gears the way other men explained football, with a level of detail nobody had requested. We were married 5 years, together 7 before that, and we ended calmly, over 2 cups of coffee going cold at our own kitchen table, both of us saying the same true thing at slightly different speeds. On the day she moved out, she told me I could take apart anything in the world and tell her exactly why it stopped working, except us. I never once looked at our gears, she said. She wasn't cruel. She was accurate, and accurate is harder to argue with than cruel. She remarried last spring. I sent a gift. It wasn't as painful as it sounds. Since then, there's a flat I've slowly made into somewhere I actually want to be, a bench in the back room with good light, and Thursday dinners with my oldest friend, Jonah Pierce, who I've known for 19 years, since a summer job restringing tennis nets at a club neither of us could afford to be members of. Jonah is the kind of person who shows up 40 minutes late, carrying the wrong thing entirely, and somehow still manages to be exactly what the moment needed. I was at his flat, eating reheated curry off paper plates because his dishwasher had died 2 days earlier on the night this started. It was the kind of evening that doesn't announce itself as important. Right up until it was. Jonah's phone rang mid-curry. His mother. He talked for 2 minutes in the clipped, slightly anxious register he reserved specifically for her, then hung up, looking like a man doing arithmetic he didn't enjoy. Mom's stuck at her studio's holiday thing. Her car's in for a service, and the trains are a mess with this snow. I've got a 6 o'clock walkthrough tomorrow, and I haven't slept properly in 3 days. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I'll go, I said. The way you say something you've assumed is uncomplicated. because at that point it was. What I knew about Margot Hale before that night was secondhand and limited. Family doctor for 30 years, the kind who knew 3 generations of the same families. Retired 18 months ago, suddenly enough that Jonah still talked about it, like furniture moved without warning. Divorced from his father since Jonah was 16, an ending Jonah described, when asked, as fine, eventually, mostly. She'd taken up pottery in the last year, seriously enough to sell pieces at the local maker's market, and she wasn't speaking to her younger brother, Desmond, who thought she'd thrown away 30 years of expertise on, in his words, bowls. She asked questions that went somewhere before you noticed you'd been led there. Jonah, in the way grown sons are with mothers who see clearly, was mildly nervous around her, not because she was difficult, but because she noticed everything and rarely pretended not to. That was the entire file I had on her. It turned out to be accurate and almost entirely beside the point. She was waiting just inside the studio's glass doors when I pulled up, coat already on, a canvas tote over one shoulder. She crossed the car park at a brisk, sure pace despite the ice, opened the passenger door herself, and was buckled in before I'd finished adjusting my mirror. "You must be the watchmaker," she said. Not a question. Dry, amused. "Clocks, mostly," I said. "Watches when people ask nicely." "I'll keep that in mind." She looked out at the snow. "Thank you for this. I know it's an inconvenience." "It's really not," I said, and meant it more than I expected to. There was clay dried into the creases of her knuckles, a pale gray dust that hadn't quite scrubbed out, and a thin white scar across one palm I'd later learn came from a kiln shelf that shifted wrong. They were not the hands you'd expect from 30 years of taking blood pressure. They looked like hands that had recently decided to start making things instead of only fixing them, and hadn't fully adjusted to the change yet. She had a habit of going very still for exactly a second when something landed true. The particular stillness of someone listening for what's underneath the obvious sound. We talked eventually about nothing important, the way you do with someone you've decided not to be nervous around, even though every instinct suggests you probably should be. She asked about the shop and listened to the whole answer rather than the polite half most people wait out. I told her about a Victorian carriage clock with a mainspring from entirely the wrong period jammed inside it by some well-meaning amateur decades ago. A fix that wasn't a fix, just a thing that ran until it didn't. "That's most repairs, though, isn't it?" she said. "Somebody's old workaround, eventually catching up with you." I didn't say anything to that. I didn't need to. I just drove and let the sentence sit in the car at whatever size it actually was. Halfway through the drive, my phone rang on the dashboard mount. Jonah, checking we were fine, his voice too loud for the quiet of the car. From the passenger seat, when he mentioned something about a rough patch she'd had lately, came a very small exhale. Not a word. The sound of someone choosing not to say something out loud. "I'm fine, Jonah," she said when he asked. And the way she said it wasn't sharp, just final. The verbal equivalent of someone closing a drawer without slamming it. The roads got worse near her building, and by the time I pulled up, the steps to her door had turned into a smooth, treacherous sheet under the streetlight. She gathered her bag, reached for the handle, then stopped. "Before I get out," she said, even, plain, like a fact rather than a request, "hold my hand, and don't let go until I tell you to." My hand had been resting on the gear shift. Hers found it there before I'd registered what she'd said, and for one suspended second, I had no framework for what was happening. "I went down on those steps in January and cracked my wrist in 2 places," she added in the exact same tone. "I make things with my hands for a living now. I'd rather not find out what a second fall does to them. And I'd rather not make a fuss about asking for help. So I'm simply telling you instead of asking." I let out a breath I hadn't noticed I was holding. "Of course," I said. Take your time." We walked up together like that, her hand wrapped around mine, both of us watching our footing until she got her key in the lock. "You can let go now," she said. I did. She thanked me, went inside, and I drove home in a car that felt, for no logical reason, considerably less ordinary than the one I'd arrived in. I want to be precise about what happened in my chest that night, because precision is the entire premise of my profession, and because it would be easy, looking back, to round it up into something it wasn't yet. Nothing happened. I drove a woman home in the snow and held her hand on an icy staircase because she asked me to. That's the whole accurate account of the evening. But something had been noticed that hadn't been noticed before. And noticing is not nothing, whatever I tried to tell myself on the drive home. She was Jonah's mother. I want to state that plainly, because the rest of this only makes sense if you understand how absolute that fact had always been for me. Jonah is the closest thing I have to family I chose, rather than inherited. 19 years of him showing up through 2 of my own worst years, and most of his. There's a version of loyalty that doesn't get written down, because it's understood the way gravity is understood. You don't lean on it experimentally to see if it holds. His mother, existing as a separate, considerable person, wasn't a complication inside that loyalty. It was outside the boundary of it entirely, a category with no door in it. She is Jonah's mother. That's the wall. I repeated it to myself at every intersection on the drive home, like a checklist before takeoff, and I believed myself completely. It made what happened over the following months less a betrayal of that belief, and more a slow, honest discovery that the wall had a door in it after all, one I hadn't gone looking for, and couldn't, in the end, talk myself out of opening. 3 weeks passed in which I thought about that drive considerably more than the facts of it justified. Then Jonah came by the shop to drop off his mother's mantel clock, his grandfather's, silent since before the divorce. "She wants to know if it's officially dead," he said, setting the heavy walnut case on my counter. It wasn't. Just decades of dust, a dried-out mainspring, and a pendulum bob reattached slightly off-level by someone who meant well. "It's not dead," I said. "Just asleep. Give me 2 weeks." She texted that evening, a number I'd had since some forgotten group chat. "Jonah says you have my father's clock. I'd like updates, if that's not a strange thing to ask a stranger for." I read it 3 times before answering. "Not strange at all," I wrote back. "Not dead, just neglected. I can have it running again in a couple of weeks if you don't mind me being slow and careful about it." "I'd mind if you weren't," she wrote back almost immediately. Slow and careful is the only kind of fixing I trust. We fell into a rhythm of small, official-sounding updates that both of us understood carried more weight than their content. 2 weeks became 3 because I kept finding small additional things wrong that genuinely needed attending to, and also weren't the entire truth. She suggested, since the clock lived near a bakery she liked, that handing it over in person made more sense than routing it through Jonah. It did make sense. That wasn't the only reason either of us said yes. At Eastlight, a narrow shop that smelled of rye and wood smoke, she unwrapped the restored clock, and we both watched the pendulum swing in its small, patient arc. "You actually fixed it," she said, sounding faintly surprised. "I told you it wasn't dead." "You did. I believed you about 60%. She asked why I'd waited so long to bring it back, and I told her the truth, that I'd kept finding reasons. She didn't push further. "It stopped the year before the divorce," she said. "Some petty part of me decided a stopped clock matched the mood of the house. I think I wanted to know if something could come back from that long a silence without being replaced entirely." "Same time next week?" she asked, when I stood to leave. "I'd like to know if it's still behaving." We both understood I wasn't talking about the clock anymore, and neither of us said so. We met at Eastlight most Thursdays after that, sometimes 40 minutes, sometimes 2 hours. She brought her glaze notebook and let me look through it unprompted. She was hardest on herself about what she did best, dismissing a beautifully proportioned bowl as fine, structurally, while lighting up over a cup that had cracked slightly in the firing. "The crack tells you something happened to it," she said. "A perfect cup has no story." I got tired of making things with no story. At the Maker's Market in February, 3 months into whatever we were quietly building, Jonah came too, mostly for the free cider samples next door. I found her stall in under a minute, a table of bowls glazed in deep blues and rust browns, and one piece set apart from the rest, a wide dish glazed in a gradient from pale gold at the rim to almost black at the center. "Not for sale," she said, appearing beside me with 2 cups of cider. "People keep asking. I keep saying no and not explaining why." "A clock face, sort of," she said, when I asked what it was of. "I started it the week your shop fixed my father's clock. I noticed the connection halfway through and kept going anyway. When Jonah got pulled away by a colleague, it was just the 2 of us in front of a dish that wasn't for sale." "He has no idea," she said. Not a question, watching her son's retreating back. "No," I agreed. "Do you think he'd mind?" she asked, looking at the crowd rather than at me. "I think he'd be surprised. Eventually, he'd just want to know it was real, on both ends, before he had to think about it properly." She nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something she'd already worked out. "That's a fair thing to want." A wet, gray Thursday in March, the bakery's old coal stove working overtime and the windows running with condensation. We'd been talking nearly 2 hours when she went quiet, in the way I'd learned, meant something true was surfacing. "Why do you keep coming back here every Thursday?" she asked, turning her cup a slow quarter turn. "It's not for the clock anymore. The clock's been fine for 2 months. I'd rehearsed an answer for that question more than I'd rehearsed almost anything that winter, and every version evaporated the moment it needed saying out loud. I opened my mouth. I got as far as her name. "Margot. The bakery's ancient radiator chose that exact second to let out a violent clang, followed by a long hiss of steam, loud enough that every head in the shop turned. Margot and I looked at the radiator, then at each other. Then both started laughing. The kind of laughter that exists precisely because the alternative was something neither of us was ready to finish saying. "That thing has appalling timing," she said, wiping her eyes. "Sounds like it needs regulating," I said. "Half these old systems just need a small adjustment somewhere nobody's bothered to look in years." Is that a metaphor, Theo? It's a fact about radiators. Whether it's also a metaphor is entirely your interpretation. The sentence I'd started had nowhere obvious left to go that afternoon. But what nearly got said hadn't disappeared. It just changed shape into something present and understood without needing the words yet, the way you feel a draft in a room before you've found where it's coming in. 2 weeks later, she texted that a small regional gallery had asked for the gradient dish, and after a great deal of consideration, she'd said yes. We met at Eastlight, and instead of her usual measured account of things, she told me she'd had to sit down on her kitchen floor for a minute after reading the email, which she found mortifying to admit. "Why mortifying?" I asked. "Because I'm 57, and I cried over an email about a bowl," she said, turning her cup slowly. "Because some part of me has spent 30 years needing someone to confirm my actual work was real, and I didn't know that part of me was still in there until a stranger with a gallery set it off." "It's not pathetic," I said. "It's the first time anyone outside your own kitchen has confirmed it was worth the kiln space." She looked at me for a long moment, the way she looked at a piece before deciding whether to fire it. "I would have kept that dish forever if no one had ever asked for it," I said, before I'd entirely planned to say it. "For what that's worth." She went very still. Not her usual composed stillness. Something different. The stillness of someone who has just heard, out loud, the thing they'd been quietly hoping someone might eventually say. Theo. Just my name. It was enough. I know, I said. This stopped being about a clock around the second Thursday. I've been telling myself a fairly elaborate story about coincidence and bread for nearly 4 months. I'm Jonah's mother, she said. Not as an objection, just a fact placed carefully on the table between us. I know that too. I've known it the entire time. It hasn't made a single Thursday feel like a mistake. I'm not going to be simple, she said. I have 30 years of habits I don't fully know how to undo, and a son who is the most important person in my life, and I am, on my best days, considerably more complicated than a Thursday at a bakery. I'd still rather have the complicated version of you than the simple version of almost anyone else I've met in years. She reached across the small table and put her hand over mine, the same hand she'd held on an icy staircase months earlier for an entirely different reason. Then she stood, came around to my side of the table, and kissed me, unhurried, the way she decided most things, plainly and completely, giving the rest of the room a moment to catch up. When she pulled back, she said, I'm in love with you. I'd rather say it directly than spend another month being careful about it. Outside, the rain kept doing what it had been doing all afternoon. Inside, for the first time, neither of us was leaving anything unsaid. I called Jonah that night, walking home in rain that had eased into something almost gentle, because there was no version of this I was willing to let him learn secondhand. What's wrong? He said, the way you answer a call from someone who mostly texts. Nothing's wrong. I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it from me before anyone else. I told him the central fact of it, that I'd been spending months with his mother, that it had stopped being neutral somewhere along the way, that we'd named it properly that afternoon. The silence on the line went on long enough that I checked the call hadn't dropped. How long? He said finally. Since the clock, since before I really admitted it to myself. Is this something she actually wants? He asked carefully. Properly wants. Not just going along with because you're around. I think so. I hope so. We said it out loud for the first time about 3 hours ago. She's had a hard couple of years, Theo, he said. The retirement thing. The thing with my uncle. She doesn't let many people see past the version of her that has everything handled. If you're not serious about this, tell me now, because she does not need one more person treating her like a project. I'm not trying to fix anything about her, I said. I'm telling you because I'm serious, and because your opinion of me changes how I feel about myself. He was quiet, and when he spoke again, his voice had shifted, less braced. She laughs differently lately, he said. I noticed about 2 months ago and couldn't work out why. A pause, trying hard to sound casual. Don't be an idiot about this. Then, more honestly, for what it's worth, I'm relieved. I didn't love the idea of finding out by accident. Before he hung up, he said, She deserves something that's actually hers. Whatever this turns into, make sure it stays that. I stood in my own hallway afterward, coat still half off, feeling something large and steady settle into place in my chest, the particular feeling of a mechanism finally finding its proper tension after a long time running loose. He texted again an hour later, just one line. Also, for the record, if you ever fix me up with someone's mum again, I'm changing the locks on my flat. I laughed alone in my kitchen longer than the joke probably deserved, mostly from relief. She invited me for dinner the following Saturday, the first time I'd been to her flat for anything other than the clock. She opened the door in a clay-smudged apron she clearly hadn't bothered to remove, looked at the wine in my hand, and said, Good choice, with the exact tone she used to evaluate a glaze test. Her flat was warm and a little chaotic, bowls and dishes in various stages of finished on shelves not built for them. Her father's clock sat on the mantel, ticking quietly, running for 3 months by then. "I check on it most mornings without meaning to," she said. "It's become a habit I didn't plan." We ate at a small table by the window, fish and something with too much lemon she'd warned me about in advance. We talked easily about her new piece, about Jonah, about her brother. She'd finally called Desmond the week before, after more than a year of silence, and described the conversation as not resolved, but no longer frozen, a phrase she chose with obvious care. "I told him the Bowles pay better than he thinks," she said. He laughed. "It's not fixed. It's a start." After dinner, we sat with tea in the lamp's amber light, the clock keeping its quiet count behind us, and the easy kind of quiet that had been underneath everything between us since that first snowy drive settled comfortably over the room. "Stay," she said, simply, when I reached for my coat near midnight. Not a question. The same plain certainty she'd used on the icy staircase, in the bakery, every time she'd already decided something, and was only waiting for the rest of the room to catch up. I stayed. What passed between us that night isn't something I'm going to narrate in detail, only that it was unhurried and certain in exactly the way everything else with her had been. Two people who'd already done the harder work of being honest, finally letting the rest follow. I woke once near dawn to find her awake beside me, turning my hand over in hers, the way she turned a finished piece, before deciding it had survived its firing. And when she caught me watching, she only said, "Go back to sleep, Theo," in a voice with no doubt left in it. Anywhere. In the morning, her father's clock was still keeping time in the next room, so it turned out. Were we? A year later, almost to the week, it snowed again. The same heavy, indecisive kind that can't quite commit to a blizzard, but makes every pavement equally treacherous. We were walking back from Eastlight in the early evening when we reached the bottom of her front steps, and she stopped, checking the ice the way she'd stopped 100 times that winter before committing her weight to it. "Hold my hand," I said, before she could ask, "and don't let go until I tell you to." She looked at me, something amused and warm moving behind her expression. That's my line. I'm aware. I've been saving it for the right steps. She took my hand, and we climbed carefully, an old habit that had outlasted its original reason and simply stayed because it was ours. At the top, instead of letting go the moment we reached level ground, I kept holding on. "You can let go now," she said, echoing herself from a year earlier, testing me. "I don't want to. I'd like to keep doing this, actually. All of it. Officially, if you're amenable." She studied me for a second, with the same careful attention she gave a piece, before deciding whether it had survived its firing. "That's not a particularly romantic proposal, Theo." "No," I agreed, "but it's accurate, and I've come to think accuracy might matter to you more than romance does." The snow kept falling, settling on her shoulders and mine in the streetlight. "Yes," she said, the same word she'd used twice before, the same plain certainty both times, as though she'd already arrived at this answer long before I'd finally found my way to asking the question properly. She tells people now that we met because her son sent a friend to fetch her home in a snowstorm. I tell people she asked me to hold her hand on an icy staircase on the first night, and that I have, with very few exceptions, been doing exactly that ever since. She says it was only ever about the ice. I say, "And now?" She says, "Now I have considerably less objection to the staircase." I tell her that's the most romantic thing she's ever said to me. She tells me the bar should concern me. It doesn't. If you made it all the way here, thank you. Tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one, and every location still surprises me. If this story found you at the right time, subscribe. There's a new one every week. I'll see you in the next. This is a work of fiction. All names, locations, events, and characters in this story are entirely invented for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.